Shana Tova. This morning, the second day of Rosh Hashanah, I want to share some words with you about trust and faith. What does it mean to trust God or even to have faith in God in the world in which we live? What does it mean when we put our faith in the context of our actual lived experience? In order to answer that question, I'm going to borrow some words from Rabbi Norman Lamb, an important Orthodox thinker of the 20th century. Though to be fair, when I'm done with them, he may not want them back. And he offered a sermon on this question some 50 years ago, whose choice of words has always stuck with me. His key insight, and he wasn't the first to say it, but I think he said it well, was that there are two different words in Hebrew that we can translate to mean something like faith. There is bitachon and then emunah. He defines bitachon as trust and emunah as truth. And I think that those two translations, trust and truth, give us a really useful window into two different ways to think about our faith. So, bitachon, trust, is a certainty, if you will, that everything is part of God's plan. Somehow it will all work out right in the end. So that Hebrew word, which, by the way, some pronounce as bitachon, is fundamentally related to the idea of security, is fundamentally related to the idea of safety. And in fact, in modern Hebrew, if you're in a hotel in Israel and you call for security, the guys who show up have a little badge that says bitachon. Bitachon is the belief, I dare say, that the confidence even, that if you say the right things, if you do the right things, that God is going to reciprocate. Bitachon is designed to make us comfortable. Bitachon is at its core about trust. And by the way, almost every time the Torah uses this word bitachon, it's to describe the feeling of trust the Israelites have when they believe they are safe from attack, when they know that God is going to keep them safe even as they are going up to Jerusalem to bring their offerings. No one is going to attack them. And there is perhaps an exception that proves the rule. In Deuteronomy 28, Moses warns them, the walls upon which you trust will be breached and you will be sent into exile. Emunah, though, is something different. Emunah is just as much a belief in God, but it has a very different flavor. Emunah, the Hebrew word, is related to the word emet, which means truth. It's also a kind of confidence. It's confidence that there is something bigger in oneself, bigger than the world in oneself, but with a continued uncertainty as to the path of one's own journey. Emunah is at its core about staring in the face truth. And so the Torah uses the word emunah when the Israelites face an existential threat that is not hypothetical but is real, and where they are saved but not completely. So, for example, they have just come through the Red Sea. The Egyptians are chasing them. They see the Egyptians drowned. Vayaminu baranai v'Moshe avdo. They believe in God and in Moses, his servant. But by the way, now they have a fearsome desert they have to traverse. When the Amalekites engage in a treacherous sneak attack from behind, Moses holds up his hand to turn the battle. And even as Moses' hands are weakening and Aaron and Hur are holding them back up, we are told that they are emunah until the Amalekites are defeated. But I have news for you. The Amalekites are like Jason in the Friday the 13th series. Every time you think they're wiped out, they return for a sequel. whether it's in the book of Samuel, whether it's in the story of the Megillah, whether it is later in history, Amalek always returns. Emunah is an understanding that even though God is present in the world, the battle is not over. If you will, bitachon is the trust that we cling to because it makes us safe and comfortable. Emunah is the truth that guides us even when we are vulnerable and uncomfortable. Bitachon is Novocaine. Emunah is filling the cavity. In some sense, the interplay between these kinds of faith is at the essence of what we read this morning. God comes to Abraham and said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering. Abraham has for decades wanted nothing more in the world than this son. And now God is apparently going to take that son away. Now, Abraham in our tradition is the very model of bitachon, trust in God. God has made a lot of challenging and even, I dare say, outlandish requests over the years. And almost every time Abraham has responded without question. God commands, leave your land, your birthplace, your family. And Abraham goes. Abraham is 99 years old, and God tells him, your descendants will be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And Abraham says, okay. God makes the most personal of commandments. And rather than saying, wait, you want me to cut the what off my what? Abraham circumcises his entire household. And yesterday we read that when God told Abraham that he must send away Hagar and his son Ishmael, that he was distressed. But then he doesn't have to worry for long because God reassures him that Ishmael, don't worry, it'll all work out. When Abraham agrees to take his son Isaac up the mountain, that would seem to be the essence of bitachon, of trust. And then there's this moment when Isaac turns to his father and says, okay, here's the firestone, and here's the wood. Where's the animal for the offering? And Abraham looks his son in the eye, as most parents do at one time in their lives, and has to decide whether to lie to his child or to share a horrifying truth. He chooses his words very carefully. God will provide the ram, my son. Different readers have suggested different takes on this response, what it says about Abraham's mindset. One possibility is that he is just reassuring his son with empty words. He doesn't really mean it. Could our father, our ancestor, could the great Abraham be lying? Rabbi Yosef the Bechor Shor is among the sages who suggests that Abraham actually fully expects to sacrifice his son. He takes God quite literally. He is not technically lying because he is relying on very careful phrasing. So this is before the invention of modern punctuation, but I can give you the parallel. Abraham is fudging the difference between let's eat, Grandma, and let's eat, Grandma. Other commentators, like Rashi, Midrash Rabbah, fudge a bit further, where they say Abraham says God will provide the ram, and if he doesn't, then it's you. I don't know if I like those odds. Of course, we all read ahead. We've heard the sermon before. We know how the story ends. The angels call out to Abraham, don't lift your hand against your son. Abraham looks up to see a ram caught by its horns. This is a victory of bitachon. It turns out, it would seem this turns out well for everyone. I'll accept the ram. Abraham proves the depth of his trust in God. Isaac survives, to be in next week's Parsha, and God has proof of Abraham's steadfastness. But then again, there are those sages who say, you know what? You are actually reading it wrong. That Abraham actually went through with it. Later in the story, when Abraham leaves Mount Moriah, I mentioned earlier, the Torah says, Vayashov. Abraham, singular, returned from the mountain. Isaac does not appear in the end of the chapter, and we actually don't see him for several chapters. Rashi, commenting on Leviticus 26, picks up on the thread and says, in fact, no. Isaac was actually killed and burned on the altar after all. Now, by the way, a more rationalist commentator, Ibn Ezra, points out that poses a little bit of a narrative challenge for the rest of the Torah, where Isaac gets married, has kids, and so on. But Rashi has talked himself out of worse interpretive jams before. This question for me of Abraham's bitachon and its nature, the nature of Abraham's faith, is actually sharpened by reading the story in light of what had happened a few chapters earlier in Genesis 18. God told Abraham that he is going to destroy the sinful city of Sodom. Abraham responds with outrage, with debate, with questions. Ha'af tispet tzadikim rasha? Are you going to sweep away the innocent with the guilty? Chalilalach, heaven forbid, which, by the way, is a funny thing to say to God, that the judge of the whole earth not do justice. That, by the way, is the diametrical opposite of bitachon. A person of bitachon would have said, of course, God, you have your reasons, do what you need to do. I'm going to stand here and watch the smiting from a safe distance. It's going to be okay. Abraham's response is, in some sense, about emunah. Abraham says, God, I believe in you. I know you're there. By the way, I am arguing with you right now. But by the way, I know what I expect you to be, which is why I am not okay with what you said was going to happen. In order to be disappointed with God, you have to have an expectation first, and an acknowledgement that in the world of truth, those expectations are not always met. So as readers of the story of the binding of Isaac, we're forced to choose between a reading of bitachon and a reading of emunah. We are caught between the worlds of trust and truth. In the story of the binding of Isaac was Abraham showing this unshakable bitachon that marked his early career. He was confident that God would provide the ram. Or maybe an even deeper level, he felt like even if he sacrificed his son, somehow it was all meant to be. In either case, truth was also sacrificed on that altar. But maybe that's not fair. After all, who among us would claim to be at the spiritual level of Abraham? So look at our ancestors. These are real Jews. These are people who kvetch and complain and schlep as they're leaving Egypt. They had moments of emunah. As I mentioned earlier, when they saw the bodies of the Egyptians drowned at the sea, they believed in God and in Moses. And they sang this majestic song of praise, of victory. Shira l'Adonai ki ga'oga, I will sing to God, for God is majestic. And like 3 verses later, the kvetching begins. They are complaining. Why did you take us out of Egypt when we might die here in the desert? Ugh, the food is terrible. In Egypt, there was like, it was like being on a cruise ship. And so God provides manna from heaven. What greater proof could there be of God's beneficence than actual food descending from heaven outdoors onto your doorstep? This is heavenly DoorDash. With contactless delivery. But the Israelites did not follow directions. God told them to gather only what they needed for that day. And yet some of them did not trust that there would be manna the next day. They insisted on trying to keep it over. It became spoiled and grew worms and maggots. And then on Friday morning, as Shabbat approached, the Israelites were told to gather a double portion, just as God has instructed. And yet the next day, Saturday morning, there were those who out there, not because they had a 9 o'clock tea time, but because they were looking for manna that would not fall. So that is perhaps a victory of bitachon over emunah, expecting that there will be bread from heaven every morning, even when God told you there wouldn't be. When God told you to go pick up your bread yesterday. So maybe we can say this. Bitachon is the confidence, the surety that God will make there be bread every morning. Emunah is the understanding that God is there just as surely when you wake up and your doorstep is empty. Bitachon is the confidence that the sun will rise tomorrow. Emunah is the ability to be grateful for that sunrise, even though we know that someday it will rise without us there to see it. Our faith perspective is always a product of our feelings, of our experiences, what we have been through recently. So the Hasidic commentator Rabbi Moshe Lev of Sassov is quoted as saying, "How easy is it for a poor person to depend on God? What else has he got? And how hard is it for a rich person to believe in God? All his possessions cry out to him, 'Believe in us.' Or if you prefer a more modern take, my autocorrect wants to turn the word bitachon into Bitcoin. There's a perspective, though, that we may have forgotten, but that we cannot ignore. What about Isaac? Oh yeah, Isaac. Isaac's experience of the Akedah is a little bit more typical, perhaps, of our experience of the world. He is a person of faith, but God hasn't shared the plan with him. Now he has to decide between obeying the 5th commandment and being a victim of murder in the 1st. What does this story mean for him? One way to understand this story, which actually makes it a very simple read, is that Isaac knew what was coming and went along willingly. In fact, one Midrash portrays him as asking his father, "Tie the cords extra tightly so I don't struggle and jostle your hand." There's this incredible and terrible beauty in that kind of sublimation of one's own will to the desire of the divine. But Isaac's willing acceptance is not necessarily the most likely read of the Bible. If Isaac was truly willing, there would have been no need to bind him to the altar. The verse that talks about Abraham coming down alone, that Rashi interprets to mean that Isaac died up there, is understood by many modern scholars in a different way. No, Isaac did not die on the altar, but perhaps his relationship with his father did. Abraham went down alone in one direction. Isaac went down alone in a different one. And by the way, the next thing we read in the Bible is that Sarah has died. According to many commentators, she was the casualty of the Akedah. She was so shocked by what had happened that she could not hold on to life any longer. And by the way, when Abraham comes to tend to her burial, Isaac is absent. When Abraham seeks a bride for Isaac, he does not consult Isaac. And when Isaac weds her, Abraham is not in any of the wedding photos. By the way, if you follow the biblical chronology, Isaac's children, Esau and Jacob, were 13 to 15 years old when Abraham died. We don't hear about Zadie coming to visit. Isaac's family is shattered by the Akedah. He loses his trust in someone who was so important to him. And yet at the same time, this incident does not impact Isaac's faith in God. Isaac builds his own altars to call upon God's name. He prays for Rebekah to have children. He calls upon God to bless his children. Abraham seems to be disconnected from the man who tied him to the altar, even as he worships the God that gave the order. How could Isaac relate so differently to the God and then to his own father? Maybe Isaac has a different kind of trust for God than he does for his father. There's a big difference between trusting God and trusting what someone else tells you God wants, especially if that person is holding a big old knife. There's a lot of different ways that we can express trust of people. The story goes that a defense attorney was cross-examining a police officer during a felony trial, and it went like this. Are you an officer with the RIPD? Yes, I am. Did you see my client fleeing the scene? No, sir, but I observed a person matching the description several blocks away. Officer, who provided this description? Well, it was the officer who responded to the scene. A fellow officer provided the description of this alleged offender. Do you trust your fellow officers? Yes, sir, with my life. With your life? Let me ask you this then, officer. Do you have a locker room in the police station, a room where you change your clothes and leave your things as you go out to your duties? Yes, sir, of course we do. Do you have a locker in that room? Of course I do. Now, officer, if you trust your fellow officers with your life, is there a lock on that locker? If you trust your fellow officers with your life, why do you feel the need to lock your locker in that room where you are together? Well, you see, counsel, we share the building with a court complex, and sometimes attorneys have been known to walk through that room. What does it mean to trust God with your very life, but still lock your locker? When Isaac is way up on the mountain, he knows what to expect from God, from his father. Isaac knows full well that his father Abraham will do when Abraham is asked to choose between God and someone else. Abraham is always going to pick God. Whether it's taking up the knife of circumcision, sending Ishmael into the desert, Abraham will not hesitate to put his children into harm's way. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, the poet, the theologian, the philosopher, was witness to some of the most horrific cruelty that humans could perpetuate on each other, seemingly while God stood idly by. And yet, he was also attuned to the astonishing beauty of a single flower, the protective power of the Jewish holidays against the forces of other civilizations. He tells the story of a young child who heard the story that we just talked about this morning, And that child was terrified. That child was horrified. What if the angel had been late? What if the angel that stayed Abraham's hand had been caught in traffic? The child was reassured, don't worry, angels are never late. But he adds, as a postscript, Heschel does, angels may never be late, but humans often are. We know that humans, even those as great as Abraham, as his namesake Heschel, as Isaac, are limited. We cannot hold on to trust and to truth at the same time. If we have to choose, which do we cling to? So you can ask yourself, do you believe in God as a comfort or even a crutch? No matter what, it will always be okay. Or do you believe that God is a creator and a constant? That things may not turn out all right every time. That doesn't mean God isn't there. Do you hold on to trust or truth? There's a genre of literature that presents this version of trust, this bitachon. There's a poem called Footprints in the Sand. I don't know if any of you have had this forwarded it to you, someone sent it to you on Facebook, whatever. Now, by the way, as a side note, there has been some spectacular litigation. I wanted to attribute the poem, but there was apparently a 5-way lawsuit as to who wrote this poem, who owned the rights to it. That's like blood on the sand, basically. But the gist of the poem is that someone is looking back on their life's journey, and they see it represented, metaphorically speaking, as a journey along a sandy beach. Along many stretches, there are 2 sets of footprints, but at those that represent the times of trouble, the lowest, the saddest times, there's only one. The speaker confronts God, who responds. The speaker says, at my worst times, there's only one set of footprints. How can I be alone? And God responds, when you saw only one set of footprints, it was then that I carried you. It's a lovely, touching poem. Reflects an amazing trust in God. If it's gotten you through hard times, this is a great time to take your during the sermon nap. Because when I look at the world, I often see 2 sets of footprints. And sometimes, when I look on the journeys of the lives of those around me, it's just a big, messy trench where God has dragged them, kicking and screaming. Sometimes the waves have washed up so far on the shore, you actually can't see where the footprints are anymore. You don't know how you got from where you were to where you are, let alone where God was in all of this. And then I remember that God doesn't technically have feet. God is on the whole beach, not just the part that we happen to be walking on at that moment. God is in the sun, whether it warms us from the chill waters or burns our skin. God is in the very sand, whether it cushions our fall or chafes. Whether the waves' gentle sound soothes us to sleep, or the undertow threatens to drag us under, God is in the water all the same. In a little while, we are going to read a prayer called Unatana Tokef. It's a litany of all the beautiful things and all the terrible things that can happen, that, by the way, I promise will happen to someone in the coming year. There will be births, there will be deaths. There will be lives cut short, there will be lives lived long. There will be violence and plague and earthquake. There will be poverty and there will be wealth. Some will have the tranquility of the beach on a picture-perfect day. Others will be swept out by water, by waves and wind. Some will have a double portion of wealth, and others will wake up to find no bread on their pantry or their doorstep. Unatana Tokef doesn't promise which column we will be in, only that God will be part of it. So as I stand here before you, my friends, on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, I will freely confess that most of the time I cannot count myself among those who, as Lamb would say, have bitachon. I feel fortunate that I woke up this morning and we have a few challahs in the pantry. That does not guarantee that tomorrow I will not wake up to none. I'm not saying there isn't a ram caught in the thicket, and sometimes there is. But maybe I am not perceptive enough to see it and grab that ram by the horns. Maybe the angel is on time, but maybe I don't hear his words to stop moving my hand and the knife. I don't need Rashi to remind me that Isaac doesn't always come down the mountain. I don't need modern commentators to convince me that sometimes families are broken, are shattered, it would seem irreparably. A faith that is based only on bitachon will come up short, where you and your neighbor look back at the footprints in the sand and you can't figure out for the life of you who was walking where, who's making it down the mountain. And yet emunah, the trust that comes from truth, remains. Abraham called out God over Sodom because he had emunah. He knew that the world is not always what we expect, is not always what we want it to be, but that we have the right and even the duty to demand better. Isaac continued to serve God, to call on God, despite his near-death experience, an experience that would forever shatter his family, because he had emunah. The Israelites in the desert held off for a moment a nation of Amalek that would attack them again and again and again. They felt God's presence not because there was a permanent victory, but because Moses' hands were raised, and they knew that the war's persistence was in itself a sign of God's presence. I have, I would say, the privilege of being present at the most overwhelming moments of life, of birth, of death, of illness and healing, of wedding, of splitting, moments of crazy, stupid love, moments of hate and shattering and scattering and sadness. It's at those moments, by the way, that I actually feel most that God is there. I know that there is something bigger than myself, bigger than the hustle and bustle of daily life, bigger than even this grief or this joy that at that moment is all-consuming. There are moments that are realer than real. There are moments when the blanket that gives us warmth and protection and shade is lifted, and all we seem to have is sand. But I know at those moments that whether I call out in laughter, in pain, in love, even when I can't see God's footprints, even when it really is my own, I know that God is there. In that moment of truth is where I find trust. Shavoneh Shana Tova, a year of trust and truth.